Thank you for getting up early to join us this morning. My name is Rich DeTizio. I'm the president of the Milken Institute. And on behalf of all my colleagues, I want to welcome you here to the second day of the 20th Annual Global Conference. I thought I would just kick off this session with a quote. And the quote is, we'll see who said it. The announcement the president just made is significant, I believe, because it contributes to the end of days where women are seen in high places one at a time. Who said that? It was Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1993 when she accepted the nomination to the Supreme Court. And something else monumental in Washington happened in 1993. A women's room was installed in the US Senate. But if you were in the House, you would have had to wait until 2011 for a ladies' room when there were 76 female members of the House of Representatives at that time. So this is an issue that's important to us at the Institute, gender equality around the world, whether it's on boards or what's happening to girls in Africa and education around the world. But I think the sign that the Senate and House sent is you have to expect that women are coming and realize that they are. So part of that, we try and hold ourselves to a metric, and hopefully you've seen an increase in the number of women that are speaking here on panels. We co-opted the 30% club and tried to get 30%. We fell a tiny bit short this year, but I'm sure next year we will achieve it. And even in the audience, you're going to see more diversity. So with that, I want you to enjoy the panel. Thank you again for coming, and I'll turn it over to you, Celia Huber. Thank you.
All right, great. Hi, so I'm Celia Huber. I'm a senior partner at McKinsey & Company, and I'm thrilled to be here. We have been part of a conversation on gender diversity, as I'm sure you guys have, within management, leadership, and at the board level. And quite frankly, most of the conversations are pretty pessimistic. They talk about that there's been little to no movement, and in fact, even at the board level, that's true. For U.S. large cap companies, it's about 19% women at the board level, and in addition to that, that puts us 13th relative to other countries, so the U.S. is 13th. We were tired of having that negative conversation, and as I talked to my panelists, they also were thinking about what are the best practices. So we took a look, and you'll see some of the research scattered around the room. We took a look at the top 50 companies in the US, again, large cap companies, to see what types of changes they made. And what we found is there really are a set of companies that are doing well. Of that top 50, 33% of their board members are women. And in fact, they've been moving the needle. The top companies, over 50% women. And as you see over time, they've actually made progress. So since 2005, they have raised the percentage of women on their boards by 24 percentage points. So what we found is there are some companies that are having success and that are really bright spots in this rather than kind of weighted down by the pessimism of not making any change. And that's really why I've invited our three panelists here today to tell you about the successes that they've had. In our research, we found that the CEOs and the chairman of the board can make real differences. And really it's in three ways. One, by having the mindset. Two, by opening the aperture of who they're looking for board members. So moving away from previous CEOs or sitting CEOs. And the third is by using their and their board's personal networks and expanding those networks to try to include more women. And I think you'll find that our three panelists today have done that. Let me introduce them. So first, to my left is Tyagarajan, and he is the president and CEO of Genpact. Genpact is a global leader in providing digitally powered business services and process management to its clients and has about $2.5 billion in annual revenues. He is passionate about diversity and is serving on the board of Panelist and the Center for Talent Innovation, and is one of the founding members of the U.S. chapter of the 30% Club. Tiger participated in our recent McKinsey quarterly article and was interviewed for that, and he can talk about what it's like to make a big shift in the percentage of women on the board for a mid-cap company. Denise Morrison, to Tiger's left, is the president and CEO of Campbell Soup Company, which is an $8 billion global food company and, as you know, an iconic brand. She is the 12th leader in the company's 148-year history, and Campbell's has close to 40% representation of women on their board, having made consistent progress over the last decade. In addition to her role at Campbell's, Denise serves as a board member for MetLife and is co-chair of the Consumer Goods Forum and serves on that organization's board as well. And she's got previous board experience at a number of boards. I'm sure she'll share some of that with us today. And to Denise's left is Ron O'Hanley. He's the president and CEO of State Street Global Advisors, which is the investment management firm of State Street Corporation and is one of the largest investment managers in the world with $2.4 trillion in assets under management. State Street has been out front and center in the topic of gender diversity, including the creation of the SHE Index, which tracks U.S. large-cap companies with best-in-class gender diversity among their senior leaders. And State Street has really been in the center, literally, of the financial services district's conversation about diversity with their famous statue of the fearless girl. So we'll hope Ron will tell us a little bit about that. I wanted to let you know that we will take questions from the audience, and I will leave time for that. So start thinking about your questions now. I'll get us started with a few questions. First, I'd like to ask all of our panelists, and maybe we start with Ron, what convinced you that this is an important topic to increase female board representation? What's the business case from your perspective?
Well, for us, first of all, thank you all for being here. This is a really important topic, and we're really glad to have your attention on it. For us, going back to the amount of money that we manage on behalf of clients, much of that is, about 1.8 trillion of that is index assets. And if you think about that, being in an index fund is truly permanent long-term capital. So for us, we don't have the ability to say, we don't like the way this company is governing itself, therefore we're going to throw it out of the index. We have to stay invested and have to stay engaged. And as a result of that, we have a stewardship program that looks very much at how the companies are governed. And for us, it all comes down to the overarching thought of, at the center of this company is their strong, effective, independent board leadership. And the evidence is just overwhelming that you can't meet those criteria without having diversity. That, coupled with the fact that there's numerous studies out there, including our own work, by the way, on the creation of the diversity index, we actually saw that companies that had leadership that included women, a high proportion of women on boards, high proportion of women in top management, high proportion of women on senior management, just perform better. So for us, it was just evidence-based that if we are committed to the long term on the part of our clients, that this has to change, and we need to see more women on boards.
Good. Denise, what's your perspective on the same question?
So I threw out the number 27. There's only 27 female CEOs in the Fortune 500. Sometimes it goes to 28, sometimes it goes to 26. But still, think about it, it's a very low number. When you think about female representation on boards, it's about 15.7%. People of color, it's 12.8%. Something has to change. We can't keep going like this, or we're going to keep getting what we got. You look at the bottom of the Catalyst pyramid, the entry-level positions, 47% are women. So it's almost a 50-50 ratio, but something happens as they climb that pyramid. There's only 25% of board seats occupied by women. So this is a very important topic. For me personally, it just makes such logical sense because I'm in a consumer products business and most of my consumers, or half of them, are women. So why wouldn't I have representation on the board of that incredible constituency? I think that's really good for shareholder value, which is a big part of my job and a big part of a director's job on a board, to make sure that company is increasing shareholder value. Second point is to get the board to be a strategic asset for the execution of the strategy or for a, again, representation of the key stakeholders. there has to be diversity of thought. And diversity of thought it goes beyond just race and gender. It should be thought about in terms of board composition to line up with what are the skills and competencies needed to execute that company's strategy. So I find that having a diverse board brings that kind of diversity of thought to the table, and you get better ideas and better decisions.
That's great. And Tiger, for you?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me to the forum to talk about a topic that we in the company and I am very passionate about. So a little bit of history. We grew up and were fortunate to grow up as part of General Electric. And as a result, we've always had programs that found a way to get to the 50-50 balance that Denise talked about inside our company. And for us, it's more about inside the company because we are a professional services organization. Our objective is to leverage talent across the world. So how tragic it would be if we can't leverage 50% of the talent of the world. That was the thought. And the second thought was that you really get the best ideas when you get diverse thinking into the room that then solves for pretty complex problems these days. As we started pushing that agenda, and we've been doing it now for 15 plus years, it is a tough haul. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have 50-50. As you go higher, to Denise's point, it narrows down. So when I took over as the CEO, having been in the company for all of the 20-odd years, in 2011, we had 0 board members. And I said how easy it is, to actually change that. There's no succession planning needed. There's no big push needed. You just have to act. So we started the process in 2012, and we ended up about 9 months back with 3 board members out of 11. And what that's done is, one, inside the company, there is now role models that people look up to. In the last 9 months, I've added 2 leaders into my team of 12, the Chief Strategy Officer and the Chief Marketing Officer, and both of them were women, hired from the outside with a slate that was unbelievable. And I think part of that is because the board is different. Not to talk about the other things that both Ron and Denise talked about, which is the diversity of conversation in the boardroom itself.
That's terrific. Let me turn to Denise. You guys have made huge progress at the Campbell's board. In fact, 5 out of your 13 members of the board are women, and that puts you in really the top echelon of companies in the U.S. in terms of board diversity. Can you talk a little bit about the journey that you've been on and how you've managed to get there?
Yeah. Well, I think that what we've done well as a Campbell board is really focus on board composition. There's some seismic shifts out there that are changing the world of food, whether it's generational shifts from baby boomers to millennials, changing consumer preferences for food and fresh health and well-being, functional, organic, the digital tsunami that's hitting, in many ways, infrastructure as well as the way we connect with consumers. And then finally, what I call a global economic realignment with a shrinking middle class in developed markets and a burgeoning middle class in emerging markets. To deal with the external changes that are going on in the world and also the internal changes that we had to make as a company, we needed to have a board that represented the skill sets and competencies that would be able to help take our company into the future. We're 148 years old. We want to be here another 150 years. Not me personally, but the point is that you have to morph and really look at, do you have not only the management team to take the company forward, but also the board. And so that led us to, as we did board turnover and we did recruiting, what we insisted on was a slate that reflected a spec that we were looking for in terms of filling in a skill or competency that we thought was needed, and we insisted on a diverse slate with the best talent to fill that need. And quite frankly, we got some fabulous women and fabulous people of color to be able to think through that as part of our board composition. So I actually think we got the best talent, and they happen to be diverse.
That's terrific. And you talked a little bit about the pipeline. Tiger, you talked about the pipeline and the 2 recent hires. As a smaller company, do you think that mid-cap companies have specific challenges in finding that pipeline of talent? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
No, that's true. So think about us, smaller company versus both my colleagues here, and also a company that is not really well known as compared to having someone in the home, like Campbell soup. So we had to fight those challenges, but we have one advantage. We have a G heritage, we have a network, and we deal with large corporations at the C-suite, so that does give us an advantage of a network. So when we started, we actually decided deliberately that we wanted to add women on the board, so therefore we did not have a diverse slate. And that was very deliberate. We had a completely non-diverse slate. Only women were allowed to get onto the slate. That made it challenging. We had to change our headhunter in the process because we realized that the person we were working with basically went back to the same pond or pool again and again. And those changes did make a difference. Interestingly, we actually wanted, in the last round, we actually wanted only one additional board member. We found finally 2 candidates that we couldn't agree to let either of them go. So we actually added both of them.
That's terrific. Ron, you have a number of these conversations with CEOs, and in fact, in March, State Street Global Advisors released guidance on gender diversity at the board level as part of your governance guidelines. When you talk to CEOs and they tell you it's hard or other types of challenges, how do you have those conversations about pushing through?
Well, there's no question that I think many companies are trying, but I think it goes back to the point that my colleague just said here in terms of expanding the lens. What you find in the typical board search is, and if you actually talk to board members, gee, how did you get recruited to that board? Well, I knew a board member, or I knew a sitting executive that was at that company. And that's just a sign that the lens is just too narrow. That coupled with the fact that for many search firms that do this work, this is a loss leader. Right, they're not making a lot of money on this. What they really want is the CEO assignment or top executive assignment. So the companies that we believe are doing it well are being much more systematic, particularly about this idea of where might this pipeline come from. Everybody, if you look at any board job description, what it'll say is we want a sitting CEO. Well, there's only so many of them, and frankly, boards of those companies are putting a lot of pressure on CEOs to not do that, and certainly to limit that activities. So by definition, if that's what your criteria are, first of all, you're fishing in a pond that has very few women to begin with, and you're just going to perpetuate the problem. But if you think about large companies, I'll give you a couple examples of how you might expand the pipeline. If you think about large companies today, you've got divisions. You've got divisions that are run by very talented women. Some of these divisions are in fact as large as Fortune 500s. And even if they're not, they have the complexity, they're facing the same kind of issues. A second area to think about is the US military. Right? Given the basically war footing we've been on now for the past 20 years, you actually have very talented women that have come into the US military, have progressed to senior officer ranks, and are now coming out. Those are just 2 examples, but it's this idea of think beyond that network of, gee, who do you know that might want to be on my board?
Mm-hmm. That's terrific. Denise, you talked about this being kind of smooth sailing and a clear business imperative to have more women on the board. Did you guys have any challenges in finding those folks?
Well, yeah, and I think it took a lot of discussion in terms of casting a wider net, which is brought up already. If you just look at sitting CEOs, it's slim pickings, or we're going to be exhausted. The point is if you open up that net to at least the C-suite, or even we've been thinking about, like, what about entrepreneurial women, and what about women in healthcare, things that relate to our business strategy that give us a different lens. I call it a kaleidoscope. You shake a kaleidoscope up and you look through it, and it paints a different picture each time. And sometimes then you get insights and you see things differently. I remember when I first got on a board, and it was when I was a vice president with Kraft. I was running $1 billion business, and I said, I want to get on a board. And so I took myself to New York, and I pounded the pavement. And every one of them told me, oh, no, you wouldn't be eligible. We want sitting CEOs. And there were 6 at the time that were women. And I said, it's just physically impossible if you want diversity. They hadn't even thought about diversity in those days. And I'm talking about in the 90s. And so I've seen it come forward in terms of desire, and I've seen the numbers move, but it's too slow, and we need to go faster.
Tiger, you've been talking a little bit about the benefits that your board had, and I'd like to just turn the discussion to the benefits that the board discussions can have and the benefits it can have on the management team. Do you want to talk a little bit about how your board helped you attract more women on your management team?
Well, that's, it's pretty clear when we started. So about 3 years back, we were looking for a new CFO. And given my passion for increasing diversity in my team, we had a pretty broad slate. Couldn't get to the answer that I wanted, which was a fantastic CFO who was a woman. Ended up with a fantastic CFO, Ed Fitzpatrick. And 9 months back, we started a search for our chief strategy officer and a chief marketing officer. But the world had changed on our board from 0 women to 3 women. And I think that did make a difference because the slate became very wide. The number of women on that slate were actually half. We, of course, biased the slate with the headhunter saying we actually wanted it biased, again, with the objective of increasing diversity in my team in order to make the people lower in the organization look up to them and say, I want to follow your path. And we ended up with 2 great hires. Back to the board conversation and the difficulty there, the interesting thing for us is while we said we wanted a slate of only women, we also said that the slate must only be people with digital experience, because that was the other dimension we were trying to cover. So think about it. Only digital, only women. That's a pretty narrow crowd. So the one big change in criteria that our board discussed and finally agreed to was we said sitting executives can be on our board. Until then, the general feeling in our board, no rule, but the general feeling was you can't have sitting executives on our board because they're all full-time people, they have full-time jobs. And they would look at me and say, Tiger, can you be on a board? I'd say, no, I don't have time. They say, see, I told you. As it so happened, we actually threw the rule out. We expanded it to executives in companies. And therefore, one of the board members who's joined us is actually a sitting executive, not a CEO, on a large cap company.
Great. Ron, you spend a lot of time with a lot of companies. Have you seen trickle-down benefits of having the board have more diversity into the management team?
Yes, and I would say it starts right at the bottom. I think that we all talk about millennials and how they think about their careers, and very much part of how a millennial thinks about their career is about the leadership of the firm. They're much more astute about this, certainly, than I was when I was thinking about what I was going to do for a career. So it starts there, but it also, it's like any other community that you want to be part of. If there's a feeling that you don't fit in that community, you really don't want to be part of it. You only fight so hard to be part of the community, and then you're going to say, why am I bothering with this? There must be a better place that's a better fit and alignment for me. There's also this idea of mentorship and learning, and we all do learn in different ways. And this is not to say that men can't be good mentors for women, but if that's all there is, a smart woman is going to say, this isn't the place I want to be. I am not going to be fully developed if this leadership team looks like this, and I've got to fight my way into that.
There is a challenge, and we don't talk about it that much, and it is one of the softer skills. And that's about the collegiality of a board and the word fit. And sometimes I think there's a perception that if you're different, you might not fit, and therefore the board will not have this collegiality. Nothing can be further from the truth. I do think that it is important for a board to function as a high-performance team, to have a degree of collegiality and candor and transparency, but that's actually enriched by diversity, and fit can be judged on many different dimensions. And so I do think that's something that nominating and governance committees must realize as they're trying to seek more diverse candidates to join a board, that fit should not be an exclusionary criteria, it should be an inclusionary criteria.
This is a really important point that's being made, because beyond our diversity work, when we've looked at governance more broadly and what does drive high-performing companies, the boards that have, in fact, an undue amount of collegiality we're going to go along with what others want, really get into a very, very destructive groupthink mode. So this diversity point, it's not just because we want to do good here. There will be better results coming out of it if you have this diversity of thought and challenge within the board.
Denise, you talked also about being on the MetLife board.
Yes.
And that's a totally different sector than the one that you're in, and it still has 4 women on the board.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of that board and how it's changed with the number of women that are there?
Yes, it's a great board, and it's the reason why it's the furthest thing from consumer products, I guess, but it is an icon brand, and I think that's my thread as I've been doing icon brands. So I have actually added more value than I even realized. However, what attracted me to the MetLife board is that it is a highly regulated industry, and the food industry is becoming more regulated, and so I had a lot to learn there. So there was a good give and take, and that became evident. But the dynamics of that board are unbelievable. I mean, it is a table of some of the smartest people I've ever met. The women and the men work together constructively. They challenge each other. There's candor, transparency. I believe the CEO believes he is really supported. The company has navigated some unbelievable challenges, and we've done it with very complex issues. We've been able to navigate through that, really weighing in, not always agreeing, but ultimately aligning. And that's a sign of a healthy discussion, and always putting the shareholders, front and center to the whole discussion. And so I believe in that case, as well as the case with Campbell's, that the diversity around that table has really facilitated navigating through these very incredibly complex issues.
That's terrific.
Right.
Each of you have talked about the benefits of having diversity, and I was just curious, and maybe starting with Tiger, when you said we're going to change the board and we're going to have this type of slate, any pushback from the rest of the board members?
No, actually, I would say we have I've been fortunate to have a fantastic board, highly respected in each of their fields, very forward-thinking and leaning forward on many aspects. This is not a topic that my earlier boss, the ex-CEO, pushed hard on. We were a young company, and I thought it was the right time to push it. When I first had my discussion with the chairman, no pushback. And then we talked to the Nom Gov committee, clear buy-in, and then the board. The one thing that did happen was the first list that the headhunter produced was a list of, because we gave the criteria, digital women. And then at the end of the call, he said, here's the last page of that, and just in case we don't find the right people here, here's the list of men. And then the discussion started, and I said, we were all on a call, I said, time out. I said, John, we agreed that it's going to be women and it's going to be digital. We haven't even started. Why are we going to plan B? Keep plan B to yourself. And then the chairman jumped in and said, great point, and moved on. So that to me is a big indication of, and the one thing that resonated, apart from employees I talked about, was actually the point that I heard Denise make, both in the consumer products industry and the insurance industry. We serve both those industries. One of the feedback we were getting over 10 years was when our team of 10 people walk in for a full day workshop, and the client's team walks in, and we all look at each other and say, oh God. The client doesn't say anything, we don't say anything, we walk out, and we know that there's a problem, which means basically our team is all men, 50% of the other team are women, and that's not good. So all of a sudden now our teams are saying, look, we can actually change that equation. Does it make a difference? I think it does make a difference. You never know, but it does make a difference.
Great. Ron or Denise, either of you want to jump in here?
I do think there's still a fair amount of defensiveness amongst the nominating and governance committees out there. And believe me, this is not to say that they're not doing their job and that they're not working hard at it, but I do think there's been this conditioning around what the right board member is, and this idea of if you have every board member looking exactly alike, I mean, can you imagine if you actually had a board that was just sitting CEOs? Right? I'm not sure that would be the greatest thing for the CEO in the room. So the point being is, I think that you've got to get, at least in our view, we see our role as pushing both the chairman and the nom-gov committee. So, we can't tell, we invest in 9,000 different companies. So I can't sit here, my team can't sit here saying, here's exactly what each one of those companies can do. But we can put principles out, and that's what we've done in terms of here's what we're going to be looking for in terms of your nomination and governance process. And are you really opening the lens? How are you thinking about slates? I mean, it's actually very creative, the way the slate at Genpact was developed. How are you thinking about slates? How was that last slate developed that led to Director X? And we think through pushing on that, we can get these nomination and governance committees to just think more broadly. Because that's what it's about. It's thinking more broadly than they have in the past.
I think that the conversation in nominating a governance committee recruiting needs to shift from what to how. Mm-hmm. I think there is a desire and a declaration typically about expanding diversity, but not necessarily a lot of discussion about, so how do we do that? What is the actual steps that we have to take? What is the process? What is the plan to get there? I mean, that is the way we operate on everything else. And I think that if boards spent more time on, if this is the outcome that we desire, what is the process? How are we going to get it done? And the search partners can be incredibly helpful here if given the right direction.
Yep. Each of you have senior women in your organizations, and I'm wondering how you're thinking about developing their skills so that they're ready one day to be on a board. Denise, do you want to start with that?
Well, I actually, in the spirit of full disclosure, am not satisfied with the amount of women that I have on my senior team. I have 2, and my chief of staff is here as well, so that's 3. And quite frankly, I was discouraged that 50% of my workforce is women, but it's so narrow at the top. So I decided to mentor the top 20 women in my company personally to understand what has to be done with the women and what has to be done with the company to change the outcome. And I'm learning a lot. I'm learning and working with these women on personal mission and a much more strategic approach to their careers with a declaration for what they want to do. And getting on a board, in a lot of cases, is a great leadership development step. We plan it and then we work it. And I actually have promoted a woman to head my integrated global services, and she's actually interviewing to get on a board, which is really great. And you need a couple breakthroughs, a couple wins like that, and then people really believe it. But I'm also learning about sponsorship and advocacy in my company. And the fact is that sometimes there are opportunities over here and women that desire them over here. The women don't know about the opportunities and they haven't declared what they want to be. And so putting that together has been an incredible unlock. And we've been able to move 4 women into bigger positions just by making that match. And so I don't have all the answers yet. I just know that I had to do this in order to really understand, because there's something in that director, vice president level where the women thin out. And my hypothesis was, is this when they start leading people, or they start becoming more competitors to men? What is it in there that makes it, makes those numbers go down? And so I'll continue to share the insights with you, but I'm still learning.
Ron, you have a number of senior women as investment officers, leading huge chunks of the portfolio. What are your thoughts in terms of grooming them to be on boards in the future?
So this concept that Denise talked about of sponsorship is really important. I think one of the things that limits all people, not just women, in terms of opportunities is, in a funny way, the world has gotten more specialized, and people rise up into a role. But if you actually look at it from a greater perspective, it's actually relatively narrow. So this idea of sponsorship and giving women opportunities to do other things. We live, I'll give you an example. We live in a highly regulated neighborhood. So as a result, we've got this enormous number of committees that basically govern what we do and interface with the regulators, et cetera. This sounds like maybe not the opportunity that most people would like, but running one of those committees is actually a very powerful way to broaden your perspective. By definition, if you're running something like the risk committee in our organization, you're actually seeing virtually everything we do and not just the patch that you're responsible for. So it's those kinds of sponsorship things and connecting that I think senior leaders like ourselves here need to do for women in our organization.
Tiger, you are on 30% Club, Catalyst. What types of things do you do to sponsor women and enhance the pipeline?
So all the things that both my colleagues here talked about are very important aspects of the things to do. Sponsorship is a big program we have inside the company. At my team's level, you start once they get there, then you say, okay, now what does that sponsorship mean? And what it's meant for me is running the board environment where it's not just me dealing with the board, and our board is extremely collegial to the point that was being made, but also include a number of people from my team on a very consistent, regular basis, sometimes without me. So whether it is a strategy discussion and a series of strategy discussions that is then led by my chief strategy officer with a couple of people from her team, with, let's say, the consulting organization that we work with, and with the board members, I'm not there. And the more that we do, the more we do that in, for example, in the marketing arena with our chief marketing officer. So that's the other thing, which is exposure to them to deal with the board and then deal with bigger issues than narrower issues that Ron referred to. And the third is, one of the things that I find interesting is it's easier to find women in staff and orchestration roles rather than line and business delivery roles. So one of the big changes that we made as we looked at the next job opportunity for my ex-chief strategy officer, she then took on and became the global insurance business leader. Our first business being led by a woman. And the whole organization is looking at it. And everyone knows that she's been a success in earlier roles, so they're saying, okay, let's see how this works. Yeah. And I know it'll work really well, and that allows me then to go back and say, there's momentum here.
Yeah. One of the things that we have started to do differently is stepping back and creating this concept of a pipeline. So instead of recruiting being episodic, like, okay, we're going to have an opening, we will recruit, we have now started to say, okay, let's look out a couple years and start getting to know some potential candidates that may not be ready now, but by the time we really we have a need and they're ready, we may be able to make a connection. And I think that's a different approach, and I think it's also good for the women that you're interviewing because it gives you an opportunity to talk to them about boards and maybe get them on a nonprofit board that they can learn how boards work when they're earlier in their career. So I think that could go to a very constructive place.
I'd like to make an observation. I think, at least in financial services, and I suspect beyond that since the global financial crisis, we've all become more risk averse. Good reason to be so in financial institutions, but I think an unfortunate consequence of that risk averseness is that we take far fewer chances on people that we used to. And if I look at the people around the room, or certainly the people of my generation around the room, somebody took a chance on us. There is no way, when I think about some of the roles that were given to me, that I was qualified for them. I had plenty of warts around them, and I think all of you here, whose career has, that has some seasoning to your career, can point to people that have taken a chance. And I think that because of many of the things that have occurred kind of since the financial crisis, we've become more and more risk averse about taking chances on people. I hear this term all the time, this is a bet the company kind of move. We don't bet the company anymore. Maybe in the past we were betting the company. I can assure you there's nothing we're doing that is betting our company. And that, coupled with the inherent seduction of going outside, the grass is always greener, I think leaves you in a spot where people aren't being afforded the opportunities that they used to before. So if there's one thing that I would leave all of us, whether it's promoting a woman to the next role or thinking about a woman for a board, just take the chance. I mean, what is the downside? You're certainly not betting the company. And in fact, in most cases, I know it was my experience, and I'll bet everybody in this room, when somebody takes a chance on you, you don't want to let them down. You're not going to let them down. You're going to make it happen. And so for us that are in those spots that we can actually take the chance, that's really what we have to do, is take more chances.
That's great, Ron. Before I turn to audience questions, I just want to ask you about, Ron, the Fearless Girl statue and what's going to happen, and were you surprised by the reaction after you guys put it up?
Well, yeah, let me answer the last first. Yes, we were very surprised. I mean, I think Lori Heinel's here in the room, and we were wondering whether, Lori's our Deputy Chief Investment Officer, we were so concerned that it was only meant to be there for a day and then a week. And we were so concerned that nobody would look at it. We called in some favors with the media and leaned on Lori. Lori, will you get on there and get interviewed around there? Well, she couldn't get near the statue, and this was 2 hours into it. So, it's just a reminder of the power of a symbol. This was meant to signify International Women's Day. It was the 1-year anniversary of the She ETF, and our marketing team is very creative, came up with the idea, but it was just meant to be this 1-week gift to the city of New York, and now it's become this incredibly powerful symbol that goes way beyond anything that we've thought of. So it's just a reminder, as we're thinking about this journey, the importance of symbols to advance the argument. And the future of it now is that it's got a 1-year permit. In fact, I told the way New York works now is all public art is on a temporary permit. So whether it'll be extended, we're happy to have it be a permanent gift to New York, but if not, there's certainly others that would like us to move it around. So
that's great. All right, now it's time to take your questions, and there are 2 mic runners in the audience, so if you raise your hand, we will get one up here for you guys, and then if you can say your name and where you're from, that would be great.
Hi, my name's Kristen. I'm from San Diego. So it sounds like in order to be successful at creating a diverse board, it needs to be deliberate at the board level. So I'm the founder and I sit on the management team of my company. But do you have any advice to me on how I can instill this in my team and have that affect the future of our company?
Maybe Tiger, do you want to start?
So it is true, it has to be deliberate. I would argue that for board composition, the deliberateness has to come from the CEO. If not from one of the board members, it certainly can come from one of the board members, but it has to come from the CEO. And I would also argue there has to be a connection that you must find to the business. Just doing it for the sake of doing it may not get traction both at the board and with the other constituents that you're dealing with. And the last thing I would say is persist, don't give up.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. I saw one over here. We'll just go back and forth on the sides.
Good morning. Thank you for the great discussion. So thank you. You talked about what you're looking for board members. Can you give some advice to the people in the audience? So as you're evaluating CVs for board members, what do you look for in terms of background and experiences? And for the women who will not be CEOs and will not have that experience on their CV, what else can they do to demonstrate worthiness of being considered?
You want to start, Denise?
Yeah, I think that when we look at diverse candidates, we're looking for. So, for example, say we're recruiting for a financial expert, we would be looking for a candidate that has demonstrated financial expertise, either a CFO or a C-suite level financial position. And we would also look, if that candidate didn't have board experience, because a lot of CFOs don't, we would look to, do they have any nonprofit board experience? Or what could we do if we brought this candidate on our board? What could we do through NACD or through some of the courses that are available at university to make sure that they get up to speed with good governance and what that looks like? And the other thing is we typically do a very, very thorough onboarding process once a director is hired. And that way we we'll educate them to the degree possible on the workings of the business and introduce them to the management team so they'll have a support system as they get onboarded to the board. But, I think that's one example, but I do think there are many, many different examples out there of how to work that.
Ron, did you want to add anything? You had some creative ideas about the military and other things. Any advice you'd give to this group in making themselves ready to be on boards?
Yeah, I think this point on not-for-profit board experience is quite important. If any of you have been involved on a not-for-profit board, in some ways it's much harder to get things done because the objective function isn't as clear as great long-term shareholder value. Secondly, being on the audit committee of a not-for-profit in some ways is even more complicated than being on the audit committee of a Fortune 500 because oftentimes the books, records, and things that you're actually auditing aren't quite as robust. So I would underscore that. And then the other point is that beyond certain expertise, what most boards are looking for are evidence of leadership. Leadership in your career, leadership in what you've done in terms of your extracurricular not-for-profit activities. So it's making sure that people understand who you are and the leadership intrinsics within you.
Yeah. I always say that networking is working, and quite frankly, on nonprofit boards, you have networks of sitting CEOs that are going to be looking for directors, and they get to see you in action in a different way. So you never know when you're going to make that connection, but the more you can also work on networking, it's really an important idea.
That's great. Yeah, there was a question over here. Do you still have a question? Yep. Can you bring the mic over here?
Hi, I'm Hope Tates. Hi, Tiger. I've sat on a panel with you before. I think for the women in the room as well, you talk about your CV, but I also think it's about being a lifelong learner, right? And I'd like your opinion on where the audience can continue to learn to be board ready. What, besides being on a nonprofit board, director education, there are conferences, they can actually build their experience, and by doing so, build their network, which ultimately will lead a pathway, because it's not just wanting to be on the board, but being board ready, right? And having the CV that shows the experience and the pathway that builds up. And then we, as women who are on boards, can keep pulling other women up. So I'd love your opinion on that.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. You hit it all. I mean, whether it's getting out there and building the right networks and different networks, maybe even being really uncomfortable going into the room, but once you're in the room, you'll find it's just fine. I think that seeking education, look, it's not only the technical skills to contribute to a board, but understanding the governance process and how boards work. So how does a comp committee work? What do they do? Governance committees. Some companies have risk committees. It just depends on the industry you're looking at, but really understanding how a board works and what their fiduciary responsibilities are. Read proxy statements. I mean, today they're like Bibles. I mean, you can literally get the detail of different kinds of processes that boards use, and it's a good education. And I agree with you. I like this lifelong learning attitude, because guess what? Boards today are different than they were 5 or 6 years ago. Again, navigating things like the financial crisis, things have changed, and boards will continue to morph. So that continuous learning applies to directors that are on boards. In fact, we have an 8-hour director education requirement for our boards. So you hit it all.
The one addition I would do, and in terms of picking a specific topic, and this is relevant actually for, it doesn't matter which part of the career journey you're on, but it applies to potential board members as well, is you better know new digital technologies. I mean, there is no board today that doesn't have a material conversation on what is digital going to do to us, how do we leverage it, how are we going to become offensive, and it's an offensive strategy versus a defensive strategy, et cetera. So the more one gets into that portion of the ecosystem and has an understanding through your jobs, through projects, I think the better suited you'd be.
Mm-hmm. There was a question up here in the front, and then we'll go over to that side again.
Hi, I'm Amy Wilkinson. I'm the founder CEO of a company called Ingenuity. I teach entrepreneurship at Stanford Business School. I'm frequently asked by C-suite executives of very large companies what founders think, how to be an entrepreneur inside a large company. I'm curious about putting founders on boards, putting entrepreneurs on boards. I think that's a diversity point that I'm not seeing yet.
I think that, in fact, many boards would seek and welcome founders because, particularly in large organizations, what is most frustrating, most alarming, and most concerning is there enough innovation occurring, and how do we foster more innovation? And how do you do that in the context of going concerns? How do you do that in the context of a portfolio of businesses that range from truly cutting-edge innovation to maybe maturing businesses? So I would think that that kind of skill would be welcome on the board.
One of Campbell's values is own it like a founder, and we actually are a series of founders in our businesses, and we're about 50% owned, our stock is owned by major share owners that are descendants of Dr. John Dorrance, who invented condensed soup. So we have major share owners on our board who I guess because they're descendants of the founder, they take a much different view, and I'd say a much longer view of the vitality of the company. And they're independent directors, but it is a great perspective that founders bring to a boardroom.
All right, there were a few questions on this side of the room. First up here.
Hi, I'm Nan Morrison. I actually am the CEO of a national not-for-profit, and yes, it is really different and much harder than when I was in the private sector. Both Tiger and Denise talked a little bit about the customer-facing side and how that changes when the board composition and then the management changes and it's more diverse. I'm wondering, Ron, if you can address that, because I know the investment industry is also making a push toward looking at women a little bit differently, and I wonder if changes on your board have had that effect on the customer-facing side of your business in terms of looking at women differently as customers and marketing to them differently.
So that's certainly one of the things that we think about, and in the investment world, that changing kind of demographics is as important to us as it is to anybody else. If you think about it, women live longer. So in terms of investment decisions for the family unit, that's really, really important. The old model of the advisor, where typically the advisor was the good buddy of the husband, actually spent no time with the spouse. And what typically is happening now, I mean, more often than not, the male spouse dies first. That advisor has no relationship with the woman, and that doesn't go unnoticed. And all of a sudden now, woman is facing this situation where this person who didn't pay any attention to her and is now all over, that doesn't happen. So the amount of times that the advisor is getting fired at the point of either death or divorce is very, very high. The other thing that we see in our industry amongst our customer base is when you really look at what happens as families develop, and before I was at State Street, I was at Fidelity, and we did some work in this area. As families develop and as families age, the most important decision maker in a multi-generation family is actually the oldest daughter. And when you think about, or in some cases the only daughter, but it's typically the oldest daughter in terms of where decisions are being made in terms of mom and dad's estate, often mom and dad's care, and what's going on broadly in terms of the family unit. So those are just two illustrations of why it's just as important in financial services as it is for other industries to do this for all the reasons we've talked about. I think companies will be better, value will be created, and yes, it's better for the customer base.
Well, as an oldest daughter, I already feel that weight of responsibility. I didn't know it was scientifically proven. There was another question on this side of the room. Yep, right over there.
Anna, thank you. My name is Hannah Chapman. I'm president of JHL Capital Group, which is an investment management firm in Chicago. And having grown up in the financial services industry, there's been a big transformation in terms of the percentage of women in the industry and the percentage of women in senior roles, largely to do with what Denise, you mentioned, sort of bespoke mentorship and then more formalized women networks and things like that. And I feel like going into the board, are there any networks or are there any resources that you're using to tap this next generation of leaders? And so advise to women here who might be interested in tapping into that, how can they become more visible or create sort of this mentoring relationships that can get you there?
Yeah, that's great. And there are also all these board lists. If I just pile on to a question, I'd be curious if you guys use those. Denise, do you want to start?
Yeah, I know what I'm doing is actually, in fact, I had a dinner last night with 20 entrepreneurial women in Los Angeles, and I've, about 5 years ago, started to, just as a give back, to have Jeffersonian dinners with entrepreneurial women, because I felt that they didn't get leadership coaching like they get in a big company. And so I started by handpicking women in the food business, all different places, agriculture, even technology in the food business, disruptors even. And so we would bring them around the table and have a conversation about leadership and career and work-life integration and all of the things that were on their mind. And I let the conversations actually flow. And now it's, 5 years later, I'm in 12 cities with over 300 women. And what I didn't estimate is they found each other as a network too. So I believe that these are the companies of the future. And so they're going to need boards, and they're going to need to get on boards. I haven't specifically dealt with the conversation around boards, but now you've given me a really good idea, and I think I will, because I do know in the 2 boardrooms I'm in, we're talking about the next generation and how do we get more input from millennials, around our tables. And so I think there is definitely an idea there. I don't have the complete solution, but thank you for bringing that up.
Ron or Tiger, these board lists, do you guys see them? You talked about changing headhunters, and just so you know, a number of these board lists talk to women alums of major business schools, et cetera, to sign up. Do they matter? Are they a good pipeline into you?
So to be fair, actually, we didn't use those lists. Part of the reason I think none of my board members or I at that time had enough knowledge, visibility to those. Now I do. I think so first recommendation would be, find a way to get onto those. I think those are very useful. But I would also say maybe those lists are not visible enough.
Yeah.
And they need to become more visible, whether it's a Catalyst, there's a list that they have, there's a 30% club, there's a mentee list that they have. I think they need to push that agenda, so our job is to go and make that happen.
I also think getting on the watch list of the search partners, because the search partners are the ones that are working with the nominating and governance committees and making sure that they know who you are and what your interest is.
Okay, good. Good. Questions? How about over here, this gentleman, and then we'll come forward. Okay, he would like you to ask the question first.
Oh, thank you. My name's Kelly Close, and I chair the Diatribe Foundation, which is a nonprofit focused on public health, on diabetes and obesity in particular. I'm really interested in what advice you have what's the single thing you all would like to see the women, the leaders and the minorities who have been tapped to be on major boards, so that they are amazing examples for everyone else, so they are absolute success stories. What do you want to see them do differently or in addition in the first 1, 2, 3 years, given that they are really busy and they have a lot of pressure to do very well so that they're bringing on another generation?
Yeah, I think 2 things. Firstly, one can be very qualified to be on a board, but once you're inside there, you realize how much you don't know. So, I'm on the board of an insurance company, and I thought, I got this. This is really close to what I do. And it's actually really hard and really different. And so the first thing you need to do is just really bear into it and make sure you understand what the company is about, what the issues are. Spend as much time as you can understanding the firm, its marketplace, its people, its challenges, its opportunities, and make sure that you're just not warming a seat there and becoming some part of some painting, but not really part of the whole. And then secondly, and I think it's in this order too, it's this idea of trying to be a mentor yourself. And there's no better way for people to figure out how can I become like her than to actually spend time with one of those hers. So to the extent to which you have the time and can spend that time doing some of the things that Denise has just described, I think it's very, very powerful.
I also think building relationships with the CEO, with the management team, with other directors, that's very important, so you're not doing business with strangers, and it takes time to do that.
Yeah, and I think very quickly coming to the conclusion, the right conclusion, that board membership is not an individual sport, but it's really a team sport. I mean, just as a management team is. And the faster that realization is there, the faster then it's as much listening as contributing and immersion. The challenge, I think, to be fair, that exists in that immersion is there clearly a lot of companies that will allow that to happen. There are some companies that may not allow that to happen. So for example, some companies deal with the board only through the CEO and the CFO. That's not a good position to be in.
I think the one thing I would add is new board members can be very powerful about giving their observations of how the board is working.
Yep.
Right? It's the effect of being the outsider. And I've noticed that really good board chairs invite this, that after 2 or 3 meetings, they'll say to the new board member, typically in executive session, tell us how we're doing. And if the board chair will create that safe environment and there's real honesty coming from that person, it's a very powerful role that can be played.
Yep.
Yep. All right, this question from the gentleman over here.
Great. Good morning. My name is John Stackhouse. I work in the office of the CEO at RBC Royal Bank of Canada. Thank you for this panel. It's fantastic, and thank you everyone for being here, because we need strength in numbers. You asked about board lists, and I'd like to share one example if anyone's interested in one that is called the board list. You can look it up. It's based in the Valley. We've brought it into Canada. And how it works is we have executives nominate women, and then we vet them. They're screened, and they're board ready. So the next time someone says to you, there are no women for my board, we literally have 1,000 women in the U.S. who are ready for boards, vetted. So we're trying to take that excuse away. It's called the board list. There's others like it. But we're frankly getting fed up with the search firms, and would love to know your thoughts on what we can do with the search firms, because we've got some leverage there. They keep taking us back, Tiger, I think you said, to the same pool. It is bloody frustrating. So any insights there would be welcome. Would also love your thoughts on how we get more men into this conversation and leading this conversation. If you look at the audience today, it's a little embarrassing for my gender that we don't show up for this. And I think we all recognize that there's got to be more men active in this conversation. Our Prime Minister did something profound by appointing half women to his cabinet. And every time he sits down with business leaders or any group in Canada, he shames them. He will look at a group that is largely men, and the first thing he will say is, this is interesting. This doesn't look like our country. So, over to you. and it's fascinating how that does start to make the men sweat. So anything more we can do to make the men sweat, be all ears.
All right, so there were lots of questions wrapped up in there. How to get men more engaged, and how to work with the search firms better. Maybe let's start with the first one, how to get men more engaged. Thoughts?
I do have one thought. It's all well and good that you have us up here talking about this, and it's all well and good that the large investment firms are pushing this. But if you really want to get the men to sweat, to have the investors themselves, the shareholders, the owners of the companies, right? We're not the owners, we're the agents for the owners. So we'll vote if an investor has left us with the responsibility of voting, we'll vote along the lines I just described, but many investors retain that for themselves. If you can get the large institutional investors to basically say this is important. So I think about Chris Ailman at Cal Stirs. right? And for Chris, it's very simple for him. He says, I represent the teachers of California, 70% of which are women. This is really important to my beneficiaries, and I'm going to push this. That is a very powerful voice. If it's the capital itself that's basically saying, this is unacceptable. And that will get many people to sweat.
Most boards have formal processes in terms of board evaluation, where they'll evaluate how the board is working, how the committees are working, how individual directors are performing, and it's a very rigorous process, and there's some very constructive feedback. One of the ideas, and I know we use this, is to actually, in the evaluation of how the board is working, have a question on diversity. And how do you evaluate the board's progress on diversity? Because then you have to talk about it, and that does engage the whole board.
Yeah. Tiger, anything to add?
Big believer in metrics. Metrics help. Visibility to metrics help. And if you take the conversation away from the board to management teams, I'm a big believer that my team needs to have goals that they go after, just as they have revenue and EBITDA and all of those goals. If there's a belief, and that's why connecting to the business is very important. If there's a belief that actually it's hugely beneficial to the business, then people will go after it. And I've seen that happen. And then you aid them by exposing them and to all the conversations, et cetera.
Yeah. And any thoughts on the search firm question?
Change them.
Yeah. And we have.
You have. All right, great. We're about out of time, and I'd like to give our panelists the last word. So starting with Ron, we'll just go through in a rapid-fire way. What one piece of advice would you give CEOs that are trying to move the needle on board diversity?
It would go back to what I said earlier. Just take the chance, right? The person may not have everything that you think she ought to have, but just take the chance.
Denise?
That board should absolutely embrace diversity because it makes good business sense. And a board can be a strategic asset to a company and should be to advance that company's strategy. And if you spend time on what is the company trying to do, what are those skills and competencies necessary to get that done, how is that reflected not only in the management team, but also on the board of directors, so the board can actually govern and be supportive of that strategy. I don't think there's anything more important in corporate America today than that.
Great. Tiger?
I would say, go back to the how and make that a board conversation. If at the end of that board conversation, there is a collective agreement that there are many other things we are doing, right now we don't want to do this, that's fine, but make it a conversation where people feel that it has to be done, and then get on and be persistent. Make it happen. There is actually no excuse other than to say, I don't want to do it. There's really no excuse, actually.
All right, great. Well, we started the conversation by me recanting the pessimistic conversations I've been part of. And I find Ron, Denise, and Tiger and their commitment very inspiring. So they not only set their minds to do it, but hopefully they've given you a lot of details on how they did it, which I think is really helpful. So let's give them a round of applause and thank them. Thank you.